So God has possessed our reins. He's covered us in our mother's womb. The idea of fencing in or covering our bodies or internal organs with skin. And he goes on in I'm going to skip verse 14 momentarily. David goes on in verse 15 to say, my substance was not hid. Substance was not hid. The idea of substance there in this verse is really strength or bones. And so when you think about substance translated here, it could also be translated with words like strength or bones or that type of thing. So the idea is David's going deeper. Internal organs, our skin, our flesh, our strength, our bones are also part of that creation of God that he is speaking to here. And then the last part of verse 15, he says, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. And that's common reference to the mother's womb. Sorry, jumping around here. Curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth is a reference to the mother's womb. And what stands out to me in that reference, the lowest parts of the earth, the idea is that God did this creative work in dark, in secret. When you think about an inventor or a creator today, they typically want to have bright lights to be able to see, to be able to form, to be able to create. God doesn't need that same means or that same situation as an earthly creator, but he formed us, formed our bodies, formed us as infants in secret, in the lowest parts of the earth, in darkness. He goes on in verse 16, a couple things I want to hit on yet. My substance yet unperfect. So the idea behind substance here, thine eyes did see my substance yet being unperfect. The idea of that substance, when you think about a baby that's forming or developing in the womb, typically takes more of a shapeless form to begin. And that's the idea here, the substance being unperfect, that infant is developing and forming. And God in that development work is really fashioning, creating, forming from a shapeless, unperfect form that David references there as unperfect, further throughout that development into the infant that we see as it's born. My members were written and unfashioned. So that aspect of verse 16. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there was none of them. So taking that shapeless form or that substance, God continues that development, and all the members of our body, our arms, our legs, our limbs, our fingers, etc., are formed throughout the development of that infant in the mother's womb. So that's what David's referencing there at the end of verse 16. So all that is a confession of David that really speaks to that marvelous creation. Curious how many of you, I asked the students this, I was pretty surprised, how many of the students had been to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago? So I'm curious how many here have been there as well. Lots of arms, okay? So if you've been there, you've probably seen the exhibit that shows the development of an infant from 4 weeks since conception through to 40 weeks, and shows that infant developing throughout that time frame. And it's really, that exhibit's really showing what David's talking about in these verses in Psalm 139. This picture on the screen is showing some of that development as well. So this is Isaiah. My wife and I had the unique experience of seeing life in an infant at about age 14 to 15 weeks of development. A couple of years ago when we lost a baby, we named him Isaiah. These are pictures of Isaiah's fingers, toes. You can see ribs here on the screen, obviously the blood vessels. And I share this as really a picture of what we don't typically get to experience and see life of what life looks like in the development of an infant in the womb. Isaiah was born alive at home at about 14 or 15 weeks of development, and he moved, he curled his fingers, and really showed for us what this verse talks about, that development of the infant. Quite often, mothers who have gone through miscarriages don't have that opportunity. They don't get to see or experience that life that's already occurring. So I share that just as an example that helps make this verse, or these verses that I'm talking about, more real. More real for us as a family, but more real just by being able to witness and see that development happening already at 14 weeks. Again, emphasis or a demonstration that life begins at conception. And this verse, or these verses in Psalm 139, really emphasize that. Coming back to verse 14, which is the verse that we often focus on as we talk about fearfully and wonderfully made, or fearfully and wonderfully made day. That's David's confession. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. So in the middle of describing this creative work of God, of the infant in the womb, David takes a step back and has to confess this confession: I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And that confession is personal. And I want to emphasize that tonight as well. I emphasize that with the students. Each of us should make that confession: I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Regardless of how we might be formed, fashioned, what our unique traits, abilities, strengths, and weaknesses might be, that should be our confession. That should be the confession of each of our young people. So, with that, I'm going to go and transition to talking a little bit more about unique design, the unique design of Williams syndrome. With that introduction, with those verses, I'm going to talk about what Williams syndrome is. And maybe before I go to that slide, I subtitled this slide, Extraordinary Gifts and Unique Challenges, if you can see that. Williams syndrome has some extraordinary gifts that come with that unique design of God in that scenario. And it also comes with some unique challenges, and I'm going to touch on both of those. So I'll cover what Williams syndrome is, what some of those extraordinary gifts are, and what some of the unique challenges are that come with the diagnosis as well. So what is it? So Williams syndrome is a rare genetic condition. This slide says an estimated 1 in 10 to 20,000. I've seen lots of different numbers in there. It's hard for geneticists or scientists to determine specifically. I've seen as few as 1 in 50,000. And so it's very rare, more rare than Down syndrome, for example. Kate has doctored at the Sanford Castle in Sioux Falls from when she was an infant. And I believe early on when we were doctoring there, I think there was only 5 individuals with Williams syndrome that the geneticists that we saw had interacted with. And so the geneticist would come into the meetings with us, and she'd open up her textbook and would be reading out of the textbook. So it's very rare. Even the geneticist doesn't know a lot about it. But named after Dr. J.C.P. Williams. Williams syndrome was originally named as such or discovered as such in 1961. So fairly recent from a medicine perspective. Also known as Williams-Buren syndrome, named after another doctor who further developed it. And it's caused by what's called the spontaneous deletion of genes at the time of conception. As I just talked about with these verses in Psalm 139, spontaneous is probably not the word I would use because we know that God fashions each of us to the intricate detail. But it's caused by the deletion of genes at the time of conception. So I'm not the biology teacher here. I'm sure there's somebody who could better teach this. But just for a brief overview, each of our cells, your body's made up of cells, Each of our cells contains 23 pairs of chromosomes. And within a chromosome, you have our DNA and then our genes. So each human being has roughly an estimated between 20 and 25,000 genes. With Williams syndrome, there's as I said, deletion of a certain set of genes that happens at the time of conception. And so 26 to 28, between that number, are deleted from chromosome number 7. More specifically, you can see on this picture, chromosome 7, arm Q, region 1, band 1, subband 2, and subband 3. So that specific small area is missing. Those genes are missing, about 26 to 28 of them. And in particular, one of those genes that's highlighted there or called out is the elastin gene, and I'll touch on that a little bit later as that comes into some of the unique challenges that those with Williams syndrome face. What characterizes those with Williams syndrome? There's a lot of distinctive physical features, and you would see if you look up Williams syndrome on the internet or Google it or watch a video on YouTube of someone with Williams syndrome, you would see individuals that look very similar even though they have no relation. My wife and I were watching a video actually a couple weeks ago and looked exactly like Kate except for with darker hair. And so you'll see petite faces, stellate irides, basically within your eye, kind of a flowery pattern or wheel type pattern of the iris of the eye. You'll see wide mouth, short upturned nose typically, larger ears, small head, long neck, sloping shoulders. Characteristics that are seen across all those with Williams syndrome that make them very similar from a physical perspective. With Williams syndrome, there are some unique or extraordinary gifts that you typically find in those that are diagnosed with Williams syndrome. And I'm going to touch on a few of those. One of those is singing and music skills. And so this picture on the right here of Kate was from probably 4 or 5 years ago. We were sitting in our basement where our piano is, and Kate was sitting by us. I told her, why don't you go play the piano for us? And then we named a few different Psalter numbers that are fairly familiar, and she just played them by ear without any music. And so she's had piano lessons, which doesn't go great because those with Williams syndrome don't read musical notes. They play by ear. And so that's what she was doing here. It's a unique gift of those with Williams syndrome. There was a recent study that was done, well, not so recent, about 20 years ago that was done. They took a small group of those with Williams syndrome between ages 15 or 13 and young adults around 30. They took a small group of individuals in that age range and they played notes on the piano. And those individuals with Williams syndrome could name the note with 98% accuracy. Just without ever able to read notes, they could name the notes. And so that was an example, that study was an example of the type of unique skills of those with Williams syndrome. Another example is that they estimate about 30% of those with Williams syndrome have what's called perfect pitch, which is very rare or much more rare in the general population. And again, speaks to some of those extraordinary gifts from a singing and music perspective. One of the other things that is fairly unique to Williams syndrome, at least in comparison to other special needs situations, or those like with Down syndrome, for example, or other special needs, those with Williams syndrome typically have pretty strong language skills, speak fairly fluently, typically have pretty extensive vocabulary, strong reading skills, and good long-term memory. And so that's not typically what you're going to think of when you think of someone with special needs, is language fluency. Quite often in many other special needs situations, we're trying to get individuals to vocalize or to say words, and the opposite is true with Williams syndrome. Actually, quite often speak way more fluently and do really well in that area of curriculum, but that can disguise or hide some of the areas where they're not as strong because of their fluency on that end. Other extraordinary gifts, hypersocial. So those with Williams syndrome are extremely outgoing. That's not very common or typical either with those with special needs. Those with Williams syndrome are extremely outgoing, talking to others, interacting with others, and they tend to interact with adults rather than others their age. So even at a young age, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, you'll see those younger children spending their time with adults, not with other kids. And they tend to introduce or talk to anybody. They're not scared of anybody, will go with anybody. There was a study that was done a number of years ago that I watched online where you would have someone come in dressed in dark clothing, look fairly scary. They would bring in an individual who doesn't have Williams syndrome, a young kid, age 4 or 5. Kid would go to the other side of the room, would stay away from this scary character. The individual with Williams syndrome would come in and would walk right up to that individual and start talking to them, introduce themselves. And so it just demonstrated the difference in the hypersocial nature. And then the last thing I'll hit on here from extraordinary gifts is just the empathetic, kind, caring personality. So we noticed this with Kate very early, very young age. She was always concerned about others. Somebody would sneeze or somebody would cough, and she'd be concerned if they were sick and how are they doing. And so you'll see that with many with those with Williams syndrome have that empathetic, caring, kind personality, and generally are very happy and positive individuals. So those are a couple of the extraordinary gifts with the unique design of Williams syndrome. A couple of the unique challenges that are faced with Williams syndrome. First, from a medical perspective, there's typically a number of medical concerns that come with an individual with Williams syndrome. Hypertension or high blood pressure is common. Supravalvular aortic stenosis is also common. So this ties back to that elastin gene that I mentioned that is typically deleted or not present in an individual with Williams syndrome. And what happens is typically over the course of one's life, the aorta narrows and quite often requires surgery or medical intervention at some point. And so that's pretty common that there's heart issues associated, not only these heart issues, but others. For example, Kate has a tricuspid aortic valve, so in the right chamber of your heart, between the top and the bottom chamber, you should have 4 leaflets that control blood flow between the top right chamber and the bottom right chamber. Kate has 3, and so they monitor that for leaking or improper flow of blood between the top and the bottom right chamber of the heart. So that's an example of some of the unique things that you can see from a heart perspective with those with Williams syndrome. Digestive issues are common. Colic is a common problem for a long time. We've had experience with a number of kids, obviously, and colic was, Kate was colicky for probably close to 2 years, 18 months at least, would just scream and cry consistently. And so that's common. Kidney problems are common. They watch this, calcium is typically high in those with Williams syndrome. That can cause kidney problems. And then there's other digestive issues that are pretty common. Eye problems are also common. So strabismus is the crossing of the eyes when your eyes don't align properly. Kate had that. This picture on the right is when she was 3 years old, she had surgery to correct that. And surgery is usually pretty successful at correcting that that challenge, but that is common in Williams syndrome. And dental abnormalities are also very common. So wide spaced teeth, a lot of dental issues. And Kate's had a couple different dental surgeries over the years, so.
They've all gone well.
They've all gone well. Sensitive hearing and ear infections are common. You notice this with Kate too. Prior to her diagnosis, Kate was diagnosed at about age 2, but prior to that we noticed this, and this helped explain what we experienced. Things like turning the bathtub on would throw her into a screaming fit. The vacuum cleaner was a traumatic experience. Things that were different noises caused issues or demonstrated sensitive hearing that you find in those with Williams syndrome. Joint issues are also common, and so from a gross motor skill perspective, movement of the legs, the limbs, typically those with Williams syndrome are very stiff, don't have much joint movement. That's very common. A few other things, fine motor, I just touched on gross motor skills, but typically delays with fine motor and gross motor skills. We originally took Kate in for some additional testing around age 2. She was not walking at that point, was just scooting, not crawling either. Fine motor skills, so when you think about fine motor skills, I did this once with the grade school classes in a demonstration, but the type of experience that those with Williams syndrome have from a fine motor perspective is what you would experience, for example, if you put on mittens and then tried to button your shirt or tie your shoes with mittens on. And so that's an example that's used for those with Williams syndrome to demonstrate the type of fine motor challenges that are typically experienced. And then social challenges. I talked about one of the unique gifts is being more social or hypersocial, but that also comes with some unique challenges for those with Williams syndrome. Understanding cues in conversations is not a strength, or figures of speech. Things like, I hit the nail on the head, or it's raining cats and dogs, those types of figures of speech, those with Williams syndrome will take it literally. So you have to be careful what types of figures of speech that you use. They have a pretty noticeable difficulty carrying on a conversation. So they are very social, but struggle with creating conversation. Quite often you will see those with Williams talk about the same things, talk about themselves, talk about a couple items of interest, but struggle to ask any questions that would promote interaction with another individual. And so that can be a difficulty. And then overly trusting of others. Like I mentioned, they will go to and talk to anyone. If you're walking through the store with Kate, she'll introduce herself to everyone along the way. And so you've got to be more cautious, or that has some potential risks or challenges associated with it as well. All right, last unique challenges I want to hit on. Attention challenges, short attention, typically highly distractible, can be fairly common in those with special needs. High levels of fear and anxiety are common. That's also or more common for those with special needs. Changes in routine will trigger additional anxiety. Things that don't go as planned, that don't go as expected. And health issues in particular, not necessarily an individual's own health issues, but health issues of others that the individual with Williams syndrome is familiar with, cause additional stress levels, anxiety, fears. And then from an academic perspective, typically struggle in more of those subject areas that include number use, math, for example, or depth. Visuospatial challenges is mentioned here. So when you think about visuospatial, it's being able to read depth. So I can see how far away that chair is from me, or I can judge the distance from here to there. That is a particular challenge for those with Williams syndrome. And so you'll see that quite commonly they have fear of heights or fear of using stairs or things like that because they have difficulty judging the depth of where the next step is or how far away a drop or a distance may be. Typically have difficulty following instructions that are more than just one basic command. So the idea of remembering multiple commands, following more complex instructions. This is an example of an individual with Williams syndrome that demonstrates the contrast between some of the strengths that you see from a verbal perspective over against some of the challenges that those with Williams have from a visuospatial perspective. And so this is an individual with Williams syndrome that's 18 years of age that was asked to draw a picture of an elephant and then describe the elephant. And so you wouldn't naturally look at this picture and think someone who drew this picture is also writing those words on the other side and using things or words like within their larger words and descriptive words like terrible or this elephant could stamp, could charge, has long tusks. And so it just demonstrates the differences of skill sets in drawing or visuospatial versus vocabulary. Those are some of the extraordinary gifts on one end, some of the unique challenges on the other end. The last aspect of my presentation that I want to talk a little bit about and close with is this idea of being increasingly others-focused. So when you're thinking about others-focused, I challenge the students with this question as well. Think of someone who you would think of as a great leader or a good leader. Could be a parent, a teacher, a coach, a pastor, a boss that you work with in your place of employment. But spend a minute, think about what makes that person or what characterizes that person as a great leader. What comes to mind? I'll give you a second to think about that. When we think about leadership, I challenge the students to view themselves as leaders. Ask them the question, do you view yourself or do you consider yourself a leader? And challenge them to think about leadership from the perspective of leadership being influence. Each of our high school age students has a lot of influence. A lot of younger students, a lot of siblings look up to them, mimic them, watch them in their extracurricular activities. Leadership is influence. I challenge them, leadership is courage. Typically, in the high school years, we're faced with a lot of peer pressures, a lot of growing up challenges, maturity opportunities. So leadership takes courage, takes stepping outside of your comfort zone, takes being the one that's willing to stand up or make a stand when your buddies might not. Leadership is courage. And then I challenge them as well, leadership is service. So I challenge you as well tonight to reflect on leadership from those perspectives. Leadership is service we learn particularly from Christ himself. These verses are from Matthew 20, verses 26 to 28. The disciples in this context were arguing or debating who would be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And Christ says, "But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister, your servant, your slave. Whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and give his life a ransom for many." Leadership is service, and Christ taught us this idea of being increasingly others-focused. At Interstates, where I work, we do a lot of leader development. One of the resources we use is this book called The Only Leaders Worth Following, written by Tim Spiker. Tim's from the Chicago area. We brought him in to speak a number of times. And he worked with a number of other leaders and did about 20 years worth of research into business leadership. And what he found, and those that he worked with found, is that 3/4 of the effectiveness of a leader comes from who you are, not what you do. And so if you think back when I challenged you a minute ago to think of characteristics of a great leader, my assumption is if you thought of words that describe that leader, it was more about who the person was at their core than it was what they did. A lot of times when we think about leadership or we think about great leaders, we think about, well, they need to be able to speak well or cast a vision or build a plan or direct employees where to go, for example. Tim in this book emphasizes that those who are the most effective leaders are those who are inwardly sound and others focused. Inwardly sound, think of the ideas of being grounded, being secure, settled. From a spiritual perspective, think of being established in the faith, strong in the faith, growing in your faith. That's the idea of inwardly sound. So that characteristic, but also not only inwardly sound, others focused. And so I bring this up as an example from the business world, but really what Tim emphasizes in this book, and what's been explored through studies of business leaders, is the same thing that I just emphasized from the passage in Matthew that I referenced on the prior slide. Christ was the example of others focused, an example for us to follow and to think about and to challenge ourselves to be increasingly others focused. And to connect that idea back to Williams syndrome, to connect that idea back to those with special needs, I use this acronym, that verse that we often think of, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Praise acronym, patient. Thinking about being others focused requires patience, and in particular those with special needs require additional patience from us. We typically have more challenges, unique challenges that I mentioned earlier, and require more patience as we think about being others focused for those with special needs. Respectful is the second word I have there, respectful. You hear in Scripture the reference to being respecters of persons. That's our natural tendency, is to be respecters of persons. And respecters of persons from a number of different perspectives, from an economic or socioeconomic status perspective. But when I think about this word as it relates to those with special needs, quite often we give more respect to those that demonstrate more talent, that have more gifts or more skills. And so the challenge that I would bring to you is to be respectful and practice respect towards those with special needs who aren't as skilled or who don't have the same level of talent as others. Approachable is the third word I have there. Approachable, like I mentioned, those with Williams syndrome are particularly social, and so it's important for interactions with them to be approachable. They're social. They want to interact with you. It's important that you're approachable. Inclusive is another word that fits with that idea. A lot of times it's difficult when we think about those with special needs to include them in certain activities, in certain events, certain outings, those types of things. And yet it's important to provide those opportunities for those with special needs to include them where possible. Granted, it's not always possible, but it's important when we think about living out this idea of being others focused to be inclusive. Supportive is the next word I have there to describe the opportunity to be others focused with those with special needs. I mentioned earlier, one of the unique challenges of Williams syndrome is high levels of anxiety and fear and uncertainty. A lot of times those with Williams syndrome or those with special needs don't need you to do something for them, don't need you to tie their shoes or help them with their coat or carry something for them. They just need a supportive word or some additional encouragement to get through a stressful time or to get through some fear or anxiety that they're working through at that time. And then last, practicing empathy. Empathy can be defined as trying to put yourself in another's shoes and understand what they're experiencing, what they're going through. And so being others focused is putting and practicing that idea of empathy. So to wrap up, I want to challenge you to make this verse your confession personally. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. You had the opportunity to dig into that in a little more detail in those verses within this chapter, to be reminded of David's confession, challenge you to make that your confession. Ask you to think about those who have a unique design. I talked a lot about Williams syndrome tonight, but there are many that we interact with on a day-to-day basis that have unique skills, challenges, difficulties, others with special needs. So I challenge you to think about them and to practice living out that acronym of praise as you become increasingly others-focused in your Christian walk. And that is what I have for you tonight. Thank you for your attention. And I will turn it over to
Thank you, Joel, for the insight and the information surrounding the scriptures. I appreciate that. At this time, we're going to sing. If I could ask a lady pianist to help us sing on the piano. We're going to sing Psalm 383, the 5 stanzas.